Hi all, it's Teresa in Gemma's house. Well, a couple years ago, in an 18-month period, I made 36 quilts because I was so obsessed with my new Baby Lock Jazz 2 sewing quilting machine. I had so much fun. So I gave a lot of those to family members and friends, and I still have about 10 of them that I kept for myself. But then I moved and I bought a new higher mattress. So then all of these quilts were too small for the mattress. So I'm wondering if you have the same problem, or maybe you went from a queen size mattress to a king size mattress, or maybe you have vintage or antique quilts that the only thing you'd like to change on them is the size. So I made a series of videos whenever I extended the dimensions of one of my quilts. And depending on the design and style of each quilt and the backing fabric too, I used a different method for each quilt. So please check out my videos, and I'm going to start on another one right now. Okay, so here's the next quilt I want to extend the dimensions on. And as you can see, it doesn't go down to the bottom of my mattress. I have it just laying right on top of the last quilt that I extended the dimensions on. So this is 6.5 inches that I have to add as a border on the two sides and on the bottom. And I don't need to add any at the top because I just put the quilt up to where my pillows are. So I really do love this quilt. It's actually just a bedspread. There's no batting in between the top and the backing. These are all 2-inch squares. That's the finished size. And I used a flannel on the back. And I love the print of the flannel. It's on a dark background and it's all little woodland creatures. I don't have any more of that flannel left, so I'm going to have to find something for the backing for the new borders that I add on to this. And I'm trying to figure out what color scheme I want for the new borders. I think the blue does look nice, because there is a lot of blue in this quilt, but I have a lot of blue quilts. So I think I would rather pick up on some of these browns. And I have some of this plaid that I could use for the borders, but I made curtain panels out of that plaid fabric and I like them as curtain panels. So I'm not sure I want to use this fabric for the borders of the quilt, but I think this pattern and color would look really nice as borders for this quilt. And it would pick up on the brown color of the board and batten walls in my bedroom too. Okay, so I ended up going to the fabric store because I started changing my mind about what color I wanted to make this border. And this was the fabric I already had left from adding borders to the last quilt that I worked on. And I just kept seeing how beautiful this blue looked as the border for this quilt. So the fabric store did have some more of that same fabric. So I picked up this little remnant. It's a half a yard for $2. And I picked up all of these remnant pieces and everything together came to almost 4 5/8 yards for $18. So I think I might figure out a way to use some of these as the backing for the borders. Okay, so I did the math and I figured that I have enough fabric to cut 8-inch high borders for the new quilt. Okay, so for the borders, I'm just going to chain piece these all in one long strip. and then I can cut the exact lengths that I need from that. And this is the same way I do binding strips too. I just take the first two strips, right sides together, and using a 1/4 inch seam, I don't remove it. I take the end of the second strip and right sides together, add the next piece. And just continue sewing without taking the needle out of the fabric. But I do backstitch at the beginning and end of each strip. This is the end of the third strip, right sides together with the next strip. And just continue sewing. This is referred to as chain piecing. You save thread and time. Okay, so now all you have to do is cut the threads in between all of those lengths. And you can use this technique when you are sewing squares together to make a quilt. Just keep this method in mind because it really does save time and thread. Okay, so now I have a really long strip of fabric, 8 inches wide, for all 3 borders. So I just ironed all the seams open on that border piece, and I wanted to show you what my ironing table situation is. My older daughter gave me this wonderful adjustable height table. So I'm going to use it as a cutting table and an ironing surface. And I put these underneath. I bought these when my older daughter was just born 35 years ago. And they're holding up just perfectly fine. And I wanted to show you that I iron on a 1/2 inch wool pad. And I don't want it to harm this table surface because as you're ironing on this and using steam especially, you can feel moisture on the bottom of that wool pad. So I put 2 pieces of thick cardboard in this flannel sleeve that I had made for the wool pad, just for some extra protection so it doesn't harm the surface of this really nice table. So I looked at all the flannel remnants I had bought at the store the other day, and I decided to use these 2. And I have almost a yard of this blue flannel, and I have a yard of this brown plaid. So I have to figure out, I'll do the math, how wide of a strip I can cut so that I have enough inches for the 3 borders around the quilt, and how wide I can cut this. They both have to equal 8 inches total when they're sewn together for the backing for the borders. And I looked in my stash and I found all this fabric that I had cut into 2.5 inch strips years ago. So what I'm planning on doing is sewing these together to make a binding, a new binding for all 4 sides of this quilt. And I think that will provide a nice unifying look, because then the existing binding on the quilt will look more like a thin border between the quilt and the new borders that I add. I think that's a great idea. So I'm going to cut each of these fabrics on the length, not the width of the fabric, because the length seems to stretch less. So for this plaid fabric, I wanted to cut the width of the strips to be between these two main lines so that they're all consistent and they line up with each other. And that measurement was 3 5/8 inches wide. So then I just cut the blue strips to make up the difference so that the entire backing for the borders was 8 inches. And luckily I did have enough of the blue fabric to do that. I'm going to work on the border for the bottom of the quilt first, and I measured the quilt bottom and it's 82 1/4 inches. So accounting for 2 seams, 2/4 inch seams, I'm just going to cut these to be 83 inches long. Okay, so I just have to sew these two lengths together, right sides together. Okay, so I have the border pinned together. This is the front of the border, and this is the backing for the border. I do need a finished edge both on this side and on the other side too. So I just turned these two under, and I'm going to top stitch on this. And then I'm going to quilt it with straight lines, and this plaid makes it very easy. There are built-in guidelines for my quilting lines. Okay, so this is the bottom of the quilt here. So I'll be sewing it along this line. So I want to have the backing facing the backing of the quilt. So I'll line that up all the way down, pin it, and then sew it along this line here, catching the binding in the seam. Okay, so while my camera was recharging, I sewed it on, and I sewed it from the front so I could follow the inside line of the original binding. And then I trimmed off some of the bulk from the border and ironed everything nice and flat. And now I will top stitch along this outside edge of the original binding, so everything lays nice and flat. And another thing I have to keep in mind are the colors of the threads that I'm using in the top and in the bobbin, because sometimes I'm sewing from the front and sometimes I'm sewing from the back. So wherever the thread will show, I want it to work well with the fabric that it's going on top of. Okay, so I'm measuring for the side border now, and with the addition of the bottom border on there, that's 7.5 inches, and I measured all the way up and it's 93 inches. So since I'm putting a new binding on this whole quilt on all 4 sides, I don't need a finished edge down here at the bottom, and I don't need a finished edge up here at the top either, because the new binding will be going over that. So 93 inches for the 2 side borders. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to work on tonight are the 2 side borders. And as you can see, I decided to make this angle with the plaids so they line up nicely in the corners. And so in this corner section of the border, I did a diagonal quilting line into the outside corner. Okay, so now that I have the 2 side borders sewn, I just have to pin them right sides together along here and then stitch it. Okay, so after I sewed the side border on, I trimmed back the fabric from the border in this seam so it's not too bulky. And now I'll iron all this flat and top stitch along this outside edge of the original binding. Okay, so I have to take some time to admire it. And here's the back. So I think it's looking good. Now for the binding. And I also have a video just on how I do the binding for my quilts. If you'd like to watch that too, I'll link it to the end of this video. Okay, so it's finished. I put the binding on and I washed it and dried it in the machines, and I measured it and it came to 91 inches long by 96 inches wide. So it fully covers my high mattress on all three sides. And I'm recording this on a really rainy, overcast morning. And I love how this quilt looks. It's so cozy looking and quaint. And I'm glad I went with the blue fabric for the borders. And that yellow original binding does look like a thin border too. And even though these two remnant flannel fabrics that I added don't match the original flannel backing, I think they do pick up on colors in the original flannel backing. And they look nice with the front of the quilt too. And it looks like Gemma gets so excited when I put a new quilt on the bed. So she's getting all comfy and finding her best spot for her mid-morning nap. So I hope this video gave you some ideas of projects you can do on your own quilts. And if you like this video, can I ask you to please give it a thumbs up? And can I ask you to check my main Gemma's House channel page? And if you click on the videos tab, you can scroll through and maybe you'll see another video or two that you'd be interested in watching as well. So thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate the viewer support. Bye-bye.